Welcome everyone to the Muslim Glory podcast. My name is Raisa Ghazi, and today we're talking about Islam in the Philippines. I'm very excited to talk about this topic. I have quite a few subtopics that I want to dive into. Let me first give you an introduction. I'm a public speaker on the topic of leadership. I used to lecture at university and mainly teach corporations nowadays, even governments. And I do this around the world, 5 continents so far. Inshallah, one day, all of them. And basically, I help other people, follow a similar career because I think this is something that's, very beneficial to a lot of people if you want to work for yourself. And you just want to have a good career. I think it's something that is very enjoyable. And follow me on my socials if you want to learn more about it, or check out my website, speakoutcourse.com. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Islam in the Philippines, and I'm really excited about this topic. Okay, where do I start? Okay, first, I'm going to just tell you what I'm going to talk about because that's easier. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to give you an explanation of why I chose this topic. And then I'm going to give you the basic facts of the country because not everyone might be very familiar with the country. Then we're going to talk about the arrival of Islam. We're going to talk about the criminalization of Islam. And we're going to talk about how the criminalization of Islam in the Philippines is very similar to what happened in other parts of the world. For example, in the US with the Native Americans, for example, with the Aboriginals in Australia, for example, with the Inuits in Greenland. It follows a trend that is now, I would say, very recognizable. I mean, if you've been following the Muslim Glory podcast, you should get the pattern of colonization. And I really think Philippines is one that I don't think there's enough information about this being shared. And I think this is one that absolutely needs to be known. Okay. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about Islam today in the Philippines because, I think it's relevant to know where they are at now. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to explain you a little bit about why I chose this topic. So basically, I didn't know any Filipinos before I moved to UAE. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't know them. But actually, I got to know them here, and I have to say, I really love Filipino people. Like Filipino people are they're like some of the nicest people I've ever met. Probably it's a bit weird because I do say this about other people as well. I think I said it about Indonesians as well. But okay, anyways, thing is I also really like Indonesians. I think maybe they're a bit similar as well, but I think Filipinos are like a little bit innocent. Like they're kind of cute in the way that they behave, like grown people, and they're like so adorable. And I have to say, like almost every Filipino person I've met so far, like I literally stay in touch with them always. Like even if I work with them, I always want to I don't know. I feel the need to develop some type of friendship with them. And the thing is, one thing I wanted to mention is on my socials, I sometimes watch these videos by this guy named My Parents Are Divorced, and he sometimes imitates Filipino people. And I have to say, it's so funny how he does it. And it's kind of terrible because in a way, I don't know if it's terrible or not, but in a way, I don't know if it's bad to imitate a person's accent. Like, I know he doesn't do it in a bad spirit, but I laughed so hard. I literally had to unfollow him because I felt like, what am I doing? I'm always laughing at them so hard. And the thing is the way that he kind of portrays them is they're always into karaoke. They're always super kind, super helpful. And I feel I don't know about the karaoke part, but they are super kind and super helpful. I feel maybe Filipino people are the most underrated group of people I've ever, I've heard about. I don't know. Is that a very extreme thing to say? I think everybody loves Filipino people. I mean, at least the ones in the Middle East. I don't know, because I know there's also a lot of Filipino people in the US and in, for example, South America, because I learned also more about it now. But basically here in the Middle East, they're the best people. It doesn't matter where you meet them. It doesn't matter if you meet them in corporate. It doesn't matter if you meet them in a restaurant. It doesn't matter if you meet them at an event. I think they're always really nice. Okay, anyways, I said so many things about them already. That's maybe it's too much, but it's just how I feel. Like you're free to make your own you know, I don't know. You're free to think whatever you want, but I feel like everybody would agree with me. Like, there's no way someone met a Filipino person and they're like, "Wow, these people are not cool." Like, I could never. Okay, so, basically, I did write down some of the reasons why I like them. They seem like happy-go-lucky. They seem very kind. They seem trustworthy, by the way. I find them hardworking. Like, I really always trust that they're really doing their best. And I do find them genuinely nice. And I put kind again. Okay, anyways, that's about like 9 minutes or 8 minutes of me saying that they're nice. Okay, we're gonna go to the basic facts. So, basic facts: the official language of the Philippines is Filipino, which is based on Tagalog. I'm so sorry if I don't know said it right, and English, and it is the third largest English-speaking country in the world. I thought that was really cool. That's what I got from the government website. They use the Filipino peso, and right now there's a lot of people there. I mean, I got that there's about 110 million people there, and the ethnic composition is mostly Malay with Chinese, Spanish, American, and Arab influences. And the cultural traits that the government, mentions themselves are kinship and teamwork. Could totally agree. Filipino hospitality would totally agree with that. Emotional and passionate about life. I would say that. Whenever I meet like Filipino girls, like we always have to end like our meeting with a hug, I feel, because like they're so sweet and so nice. I really like them like that. Okay. Interesting though, largest religion, Roman Catholicism, like 83%. And basically, Islam was introduced in the 14th century, but mainly in specific parts of the Philippines, Mindanao and Sulu. So those are two parts of Philippines. And Christianity was only introduced by the Spaniards when they wanted to colonize the Philippines. So that was around in the 16th century. So after the Spaniards went to the Americas, created havoc there, they actually went to the Philippines and then actually continued their holy war against Muslims in the Philippines. I mean, I cannot make it sound any better. This is confirmed. This is confirmed by, many different, organizations, researchers, and it was a holy war. Like, I just want to emphasize that because people oftentimes they want to make it seem like, all these imperialists, they came with like very good intentions and were very peaceful. Most of them were not, what I can see so far. And religion was absolutely imposed on the Filipino people as well. And I'm just going to be honest with you, when it came to Islam, that was not the case. Islam was not imposed on these people. And I can explain to you why this is still something we can find back, we can still trace back. Because when Islam came, and this is something Islamically speaking, a principle as well, Islam lived side by side with the previous religion of the Philippines as well. So it was like, I don't know how to call it specifically, but like shamanism, and they had like just pre-Islamic beliefs, and they did live side by side. So when the Spanish came, there were Muslims, but then there was also the other religion. So it was a Muslim country, but it wasn't necessarily like there weren't any other religions, which shows that, these people were really free to choose any religion. But, Muslims coming to do trade in the Philippines, that actually stuck. And Muslims also obviously came to spread knowledge and spread Islam. Like, I'm not going to lie and say like, that's not true. Like, they did come to spread Islam, but that's never allowed to do that with violence. And so that's also how it happened in the Philippines. And basically, this was around the 13th and 14th century that there were Arabs, there were Muslims from, I think, Brunei was another one, Indonesia, and actually, I have Indonesia and Syria. That's two countries which I'm sure of, and basically they founded these places or these like kind of like kingdoms which were called sultanates. So that means they had a sultan, and I think that's really cool because it sounds very majestic. But basically, so in several parts of the country, they had these sultanates, and so these specific two places that I mentioned before, Sultanate of Sulu and Sultanate of Maguindanao, were places where they had, this place where, a sultan was actually ruling. And so they had really good relationships with the Muslim countries around them, which made them more Islamic. And that was like Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And later on, this also became a focus of the Spaniards because they didn't like it that these other Muslim countries were, having good relationships with Philippines. And so when Philippines was being colonized, they started focusing on that part as well, even though they had nothing to do with the conflict because, these other countries were in conflict with other colonizers, like, for example, Indonesia with the Dutch. And I spoke about this before as well. And Islam in the Philippines was a mix of Sunni Islam, but also Sufi Islam. And there was also a mix of these pre-Islamic shamans who were trying to combine, I guess, Islam. And I think all, new Muslim nations had certain, communities, I guess, where they were initially still trying to mix up the religions before they were ready to convert completely, which, for example, in Indonesia is a really good example where they eventually did accept the more pure Islam, which came from Saudi. And that meant that, they stopped gambling, they stopped drinking, they stopped, I don't know if they were actually worshiping graves. I know that it is something that happens a lot in Asia. But basically all these pre-Islamic beliefs, they managed to get it out of the country. And, mashallah, that's something very positive. But what happened in the Philippines? In the Philippines, after, I think there was about 500 years of Islam, because I do see that some, sources, they try to downplay it a little bit. But there was Islam since the 13th century, I would say, but also when the Spanish came, not everybody immediately converted. And that's something what Islam is also very known for, right? They have a spirit of resistance. And this has been always a huge issue for colonizers. It's been a huge issue for the British when they were in North America. Muslims were the ones to provide a lot of resistance. It was a huge issue for the Dutch when they came in South America. The Muslim enslaved people were providing a lot of resistance. It was an issue for the Dutch when they were trying to get Malay enslaved people to South Africa. The Muslims were breaking free and they were oftentimes also escaping, rioting. And, that made them realize like Islam is, the type of religion that really empowers people and makes them strong. And I've said this many times. I mean, one of these examples of, rulers in Europe who were very aware of it was Prince Henry from Portugal, who at the time was friends with Christopher Columbus. And they were always very afraid to pass by Muslim nations in Africa or even further, because they always said there was a strong presence of Muslims. Just like in India, the Muslim clerks were the ones to rise up against the British. The same with the Dutch, same with the Spanish, same with the British and the Portuguese. So I love this, right? Okay. The Spaniards, when they came in the Philippines, they were being led by what they always like to say? They always like to say it's an explorer, but we can say, these people are pirates, they're colonizers, occupiers even, I would say. They're not kind people, and Ferdinand Magellan was the Spanish guy who actually came to the Philippines. And, a lot of times these stories are very interesting because they show that a lot of times the indigenous people of a new country were actually very kind and very helpful and hospitable when these colonizers came. And the same was happening in the Philippines. You know, Ferdinand actually came by. He was being provided with food and, you know, hospitality by the Philippines. I guess they had no idea what was coming. He did come to convert the islands to Christianity. And that is actually something that's very typical for the Spanish, because the Spanish did this not only in the Philippines. I mean, when it came to Spain, which they very, you know, recently at that moment, in 1521, the Spanish came in the Philippines to occupy the Philippines. But only a few decades before that, they managed to finally defeat the Muslims in Spain. And, you know, this was a holy war for them in Spain. And they found like this confidence to now go around the world and try to fight the Muslims everywhere, right? And so they also came to the Philippines to fight the Muslims there. They went to the US to fight the Muslims there. And so the story of the Philippines is very interesting because it doesn't just show the history of the Philippines, which I think is obviously super important for everyone to know about, especially Filipino people. But I think it's interesting in a broader perspective as well, because it shows the true intention of the European colonizers, which was to fight Islam. And it also shows that they were very well aware of what Muslims looked like, how Muslims behaved, that Muslims were a threat to them. And so one thing you'll hear a lot about, you know, Muslims being the Americas before Christopher Columbus is that, you know, when the Spaniards or, you know, even Christopher Columbus or the Portuguese came to the Americas and they said, oh, there were Muslim looking people there. There were Moors there. There were mosques there. People are like, oh, but they just didn't know what those looked like. And so they used the comparison, but they actually didn't mean that. It's like, no, you did know what they look like because they were your focus for decades before that. You literally grew up being taught to fight the Muslims, you know, and I just want to, that's also what I, along, you know, when I was started learning about this story, thought was really interesting. Like it became more and more clear that, you know, these people were very well aware of who the Muslims were, and they were super focused on defeating the Muslims. Okay. So, yeah, I think that's really important to know. And basically, what happened when when the Philippines was being occupied initially, or yeah, you would say occupied by the Spanish. One of the main things, one of the first things that were important was converting the people to Christianity. Okay. So, I mean, it's not at all like they were there just to trade. It was definitely the gospel, right? A lot of people talk about the three gospels, the three G's. I think one of them is gospel. The other one is, I think it was gospel, glory, and I think it was money. Like, is there a way to say money with a G? I don't know. But anyways, I think it was like gospel, glory, and I don't know. Anyways, there were three G's. And so they came there, among other things, to do also to preach Christianity. Okay, one thing you need to know, and I hope there are people who are Moors are watching this, because one thing you need to know is that the war against the Filipinos was called the Moro War as well. Moro War. I'm so sorry if I didn't say that correctly. And it meant they were fighting the Muslims, okay? And so I think a lot of people, am I already over time? No, okay. I have a little bit of time. Yeah, the Moro War. And this is funny because a lot of people are also very conflicted about the term Moro. Moro basically comes from Moors. They also had the term Moriscos. And the Moors were typically Muslims. They were Muslims. You know, Europeans had many names for the Muslims. One was the Saracen, which was the thieves. Then you had the Moors, and the Moors, I mean, it was, I think, directly, that just indicated that someone was a Muslim. Morisco was, I think, someone who converted to Christianity, and oftentimes that was forced conversion. Okay. what I want to tell you, okay, because this is something that I feel like needs to become part of the curricular everywhere. What happened in the Philippines is actually a huge deal because it follows the same pattern as what the British and the Spanish and the Portuguese did in the Americas. Okay. They came there. They fought the Muslims. They then tried to erase their identity. So literally the Muslims who were there, they tried to erase their identity by intimidating them, by forcing them, by even, unaliving them. And then they hid the history. And I think this is, the most frustrating part about the history of the Philippines. The history of the Philippines has been erased. Okay. And so this is something that you can find in, very specific stories. I mean, there's stories of, iconic heroes in the Philippines. I think one of them was called Jose Rizal, if I'm saying his name right. He is a national hero, I believe. Let me check if I'm saying his name right, because Jose Rizal. Okay. Jose Rizal was one of those national heroes in the Philippines. And basically, one of the things that he at some point was on trial for was investigating the history of the Philippines before the Spaniards came. And so when people say to me, that history is not being hidden at all, that, the internet is not being erased, that books are not being made less available when the truth that is written about is just inconvenient, that is an absolute lie. History is 100% being altered or erased, and it's nothing new. Okay. And so it's nothing new because even at the time of the Spaniards, once they were there, once they were super busy with trying to erase identities, trying to unalive people who didn't want to follow, Christianity or, who were providing resistance, if you talked about that, if you talked about what the Philippines was like before the Spaniards came, you had a huge issue. And I would say the reason why today a lot of Filipinos, in my opinion, don't know that much about their background, about their history, or are completely, distanced from their history is because of these policies. Because today we still have a lack of resources, but also because for hundreds of years, these people were not allowed to write or talk about what they had been through. And if they did, they literally faced prosecution. I mean, that to me explained a lot because we literally lack so many books and accounts of people who have, lived the oppression, but they are not there because they are being suppressed or erased. And I just want to make people very aware of something. I'm pretty sure they're going to do the same with Palestine. They're going to try to erase what has happened now as well. They've already tried it, obviously, by trying to shut down everybody who talked about Palestine now. Like all of the Muslims who talked about it on social media have faced serious consequences, have been completely silenced sometimes, have lost their livelihood, lost their exposure and platforms because they want to hide it. But I can tell you, if I know anything about all these different stories, in perhaps 100 years, all traces of what happened now today to Palestine might be deleted. And that's a thing, I think that's really important for all of us to realize and for all of us to be very aware of. Buy the books. Write down in your journal, pass it on to your children, talk about it to your children, let them know what happened, let them know that there is going to be a huge effort to erase our history, to erase what is happening today. That is the message I really want to share, and that's been the message that's just been on my mind since I was reading all of this and since I was learning about all of this. They did it to the Philippines. They did it to the Native Americans. They did it to the Aboriginals in Australia. They did it to the Inuit in Greenland. They did it to the Aboriginals in Canada. They did it to all types of indigenous people where they erased their history. And yeah, I'm very worried about that. Okay. I will say that, when it comes to the Philippines, like it's not a completely similar story to the what happened to the natives in America, because the Philippines was a much smaller state at the time. We're talking about in the US, supposedly there were like more than 100 million Native Americans there. And, probably more than 100 million have been killed. I think there were like estimated 150 million at least, but some people say there's many more. In the Philippines, we're talking about maybe 1 million people, of which thousands and thousands of thousands have been actually taken out by the Spanish as well, because they were Muslim, or, because they were following a religion which, according to the Spanish, was considered, paganism. And I guess they're talking about the shamans, but they also considered Islam paganism, actually, which is really weird, because nowadays when we look at Christianity, there's so many of these pagan traditions, that have become a part of it, that it's just weird to see that they were throwing around this term as well. Okay. So, just to give you a little bit of a reminder of what happened in the US, which, is very similar to what happened in the Philippines, but I would say the US is a bigger cover-up story than the Philippines. I would say that because having to research what happened in the US meant that I had to spend almost a month of my time and literally had to find out names of professors who had researched this at renowned universities, but who were still being buried, who were still after their death being discredited, even though these very elite universities were standing by them as they were doing these researches. And even today, when I present these findings and all of these professors who have researched this, there's people who will just blatantly say it's not true and not provide any evidence, not provide any counter researches, not have any universities who can back up that it's not true. But it's so accepted that even very recently, when someone was trying to make videos about me saying that what I said wasn't true, like they couldn't come up with any evidence that the professors I mentioned were liars. Like zero evidence, just like it's not true. It's not true. That's just what they said. And obviously they get a lot of exposure from people who, are not happy with the fact that Muslims were there. And so, yeah, that's kind of how these things are going. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people against knowing that Muslims were in the Americas. There's going to be a lot of people who are against knowing that there were Muslims in the Philippines as well. But I think the reason why the US is a bigger cover-up story is because the Europeans never ever left, right? They're still there, and they actually made sure to take out any of the indigenous people who provided resistance. Ooh, I get scared. So I just have a few minutes left, and then I will start with the second part. So that's why I think the US is a bigger cover-up story, because the Europeans actually never left. So they had more time to obviously wipe out all of the evidence. I mean, the Grand Canyon today, for 80%, I believe 80% or even more, is not accessible because of, what they have found there. And I'm pretty sure that it's inscriptions which will prove that there were people there before Christopher Columbus, which is something they just don't want people to talk about, which is just crazy, right? And even while I was researching the story about the Americas, I mean, I had several governments who, one of them kind of tried to let me know that I shouldn't talk about it. A little bit intimidating. Another one, they just refused to give any assistance. Even though I mentioned, specific people who worked for them, government officials, who never had been discredited, and that I just like to know more about them, but they just didn't want to cooperate with that. Anyways, that's an interesting story, maybe for another time to continue. But this was it for now about the Philippines. I'm going to continue in the second part where I will go into the specific tactics used to break down the Muslims. And I think that's very interesting. And I also want to talk a little bit more about how the Muslims are doing today. And inshallah, yeah, you can learn a lot from that as well. So my name is Raisa Ghazi. This was the Muslim Glory podcast. I look forward to welcoming you again next week. Please make sure to subscribe to my channel. And if you're interested in becoming a public speaker, then make sure to check out my Speak Out course. And inshallah, I will see you next week.